Hello and welcome to episode 226 of our SAP on Azure video podcast. Today is January 30th, and together with Robert and Goran, we are here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone. So today we have Martin Raepple with us again, and this means authentication, principal propagation, and identity management. A few months ago, Martin had published a blog post about identity and access management with Microsoft Entra and how to manage access to SAP BTP. Now he published part 2, where he extends the cloud-only scenario with a hybrid identity setup that requires managing the user lifecycle across Microsoft Active Directory, Entra ID, BTP, SAP CIS, and an SAP system on-premise. So welcome, Martin, back to our show. Before we dive into the topic, as always, maybe a quick introduction from your side.
Yes, thanks, Holger. Yeah, welcome, and thanks again for inviting me to the show. Martin Raepple, I'm with Microsoft since 5 years, joined from SAP, where I spent most of my business life, almost 15 years, different roles at SAP. I was a product owner for the security services in SAP BTP, and now I'm in a role of a technical program manager, taking care of SAP as Microsoft's customer and helping and working together with SAP on such fascinating topics like SAP IDM migration to Entra.
And perfect. And we were just talking about this. We see that more and more customers are waking up, basically, that they're seeing, well, there is something that you need to do with IDM. And obviously, with Entra ID, we have a good solution, and we have a recommendation from SAP to go to Entra ID. So maybe you can catch us up where we are. Why is this important? And show us our approach with SAP.
Yes. So let me go into a presentation mode and let me quickly share my screen. So yeah, as you said, Holger, there is this end of life announced from SAP quite some time ago. We had, and let me quickly go, let me go to, I need to go to presentation mode quickly. So now here we go.
Yes, perfect.
So now I hope you can see
the full
screen.
Good, all good.
So yes, there was this announcement made in 2024 at the DSAG Technologietage, a tech event organized by the German-speaking SAP user group, where at that time still Jürgen Müller announced that SAP will discontinue maintenance of their SAP Identity Management products by 2027 with an extended maintenance option until 2030. However, certainly that caused some activity in the SAP community to think about how to deal with this end of life and where to migrate to. And at the same time, Jürgen Müller announced that there is a close collaboration with Microsoft, specifically with the Microsoft Entra portfolio, to help existing SAP Identity Management customers to migrate to Entra with their identity management scenarios. So we also talked about this in episode 203, where we also invited colleagues from the Microsoft engineering and SAP engineering teams, also from DSAG. Janice Rondorf joined. So we had already, I think, a good introduction to the activities that resulted out of or from this close collaboration. So I would recommend everyone watching this episode maybe to also take a look at episode 203, because there I think you get all of the context that is needed for today's session. So, but in a nutshell, what did we do? We basically, what did both companies agreed? We basically said we want to deepen the integration between Microsoft's and SAP's product portfolio in the area of identity and access management. What does that mean? That basically means on the Microsoft side, a close integration of SAP's portfolio with Microsoft Entra, specifically Entra ID Governance, which is like a subcomponent within the overall Microsoft Entra portfolio that specifically focuses on identity and access lifecycle management, implementing workflows, approval workflows, etc., etc. On the SAP side, certainly we have also quite prominent solutions in place, such as the SAP Cloud Identity Services, which is the central identity and access management solution in the cloud from SAP that connects to SAP's cloud solutions as well as to SAP's on-prem solutions. And as we all know, at least those who are a little bit familiar with the SAP security portfolio, there's also the SAP Identity Access Governance and SAP Access Control products, so the on-prem solution for risk and compliance, as well as the cloud-based solution IAG, and also integration with those risk and compliance solutions is intended by the close collaboration. On the integration with HR, which is certainly also always in scope when we talk about identity and access management, there are already, fortunately, existing solutions, such as our integration from Entra to SAP SuccessFactors, as an example, or SAP HCM. Yeah, so there is, so we don't start from scratch, definitely, yeah, because the collaboration also in this space, besides many other areas and activities, but on the level of security, identity, and access management, I mean, we basically look back to a quite long history already, right? And the announcement made around this time last year basically meant a further intensivate strengthening this collaboration in this area even further. Yeah. All right. So I heard from customers when I talk to our joint customers, I quite often heard that they would like to see guidance on specific scenarios, and that motivated me to start with a blog post series that I started. In the first part I published in September last year, and the second part just this week. The first part of the series talks about or gives a tutorial-like guidance on federated access management but in a purely cloud-only scenario, as you mentioned, Holger, in the intro. Yeah, so there is it's basically the integration between Entra ID in the cloud and with Entra ID governance as for identity processes and lifecycle management processes and cloud identity services on the BTP side. But there was no user provisioning involved in this scenario, part one of this blog post series. We basically transfer any identity information and access relevant information in the security token issued by Entra to BTP, because on BTP side, if you have native cloud applications, such as, for example, the Business Application Studio, for example, they do not rely on an existing user in the underlying user directory on the BTP side, which is typically the Cloud Identity Services tenant. So those applications can also be accessed with only a token that contains all of the relevant or necessary identity information of the user, plus maybe, for example, group memberships that indicate certain access levels on the BTP side that are mapped to role collections there. So, long story short, part one focused completely on a purely federated scenario. Now, we also know that in many of the SAP scenarios, we still require the existence of a user account in the local user directory or user store of the application. Probably the most prominent example is S/4HANA, right? So in the underlying ABAP server always needs a user that exists in that system in order to assign, for example, roles to that user and manage authorization. So there is no way around, just like we did in part one, by purely federating basically a transient user with the token into the system that will basically disappear once the session is ended. Yeah. So in part 2, and that's why I hear quite a lot of times from our joint customers that they specifically seek for guidance on user provisioning, which is definitely also the key functionality of SAP's identity management product, right? I mean, it basically takes care as a powerful engine in the center of many SAP and even non-SAP systems and solutions to provision users into those systems. Yeah? So that was and still is until 2027, yeah, the main functionality of SAP IDM in our customers. So both of these scenarios, part 1 and part 2 of the block series, and also hopefully in the near future also following parts in this block series, all center around our joint SAP and Microsoft reference architecture for Microsoft Entra or for applying or for using Microsoft Entra for identity and lifecycle management in SAP scenarios. It is shown here again on this slide. So basically it puts, as you can see, Cloud Identity Service in the center of this architecture with all its subcomponents, identity authentication, so the cloud-based IDP, identity directory, which is the local user directory in a cloud identity services tenant, and certainly identity provisioning, which is the component that, or the engine that synchronizes user to SAP cloud solutions as well as to on-premise solutions. And on the left-hand side on this picture, we basically see Entra, which is integrated using common single sign-on protocols such as OIDC or SAML with the identity authentication tenant, but also leverages another standard, important standard in the area of user provisioning, which is the SCIM protocol. And that integrates with the identity directory and is able to provision users into identity directory and from there to other SAP solutions and on-premise systems. So in today's series of the podcast, we want to focus on those yellow marked components. Yeah, so we take basically a look at the scenario I described in part 2 of my blog post series, and which is all about provisioning. Yeah, and that's why the yellow marked elements here in the reference architecture basically are in scope of such a provisioning scenario. So we start, so the leading identity store is Microsoft Entra in this scenario. So this is also where we assign users to groups, where we manage authorizations, where we take care for attribute transformations and mappings, etc., etc. We'll take a look at that in a second, a little bit more detail. And we have then in the center identity directory and identity provisioning, which then takes care for provisioning a user to SAP, to an SAP system on-prem via the cloud connector. This basically the same picture in a slightly different format, so more on a solution architecture perspective is shown on this slide. And that's basically the scenario in more detail that we take a look at today. So let me start from right to left. So we have a user that we want and that doesn't exist yet in the corporate Active Directory of our fictitious company.
So
here.
A new employee that joins the company or whatever.
Exactly. For example, a new employee which is created in the company's Active Directory. The objective is to have this user enable. So once this user is created, that user, depending on his or her attributes, should have access to the SAP backend system, the one showing over here. The user should also be enabled to single sign-on using secure network communications or SNC with a Kerberos ticket that can be obtained from that Active Directory. So to single sign-on that user to that system. And second, since we are in a hybrid scenario here and in a cross-platform scenario, we also want to make sure that this user is also able to access the Microsoft applications, so Microsoft 365 applications such as Word, Excel, etc. Yeah, so and all of
so
these.
Really, Sorry, so really an on-prem scenario, right? I mean, I'm using
Yes,
Active Directory. We're talking about Active Directory here at the moment. So
exactly.
it's in my company, it's in my on-premise. I run it somewhere. I have my SAP system sitting next
Yeah.
to me, basically also on-premise. In SU01, there's currently no user, and now you do some magic here, basically.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, fortunately, the magic is done not by by me, but by our joint product portfolio. So the user gets synchronized from the Active Directory to with our Entra Cloud
Hmm.
sync provisioning agent, which basically also uses the same standard that is also used between Entra and Cloud Identity Services.
Hmm.
So that SCIM protocol is also used here by the Cloud Sync provisioning agent to synchronize users that were created or updated in Active Directory or deleted into the connected Entra ID tenant in the cloud. From there, the user may get auto-assigned, and again, we want to fully automate this process. Yeah. So the objective
Yeah.
is that no administrator should at any point in time do any manual steps here in this to
Hmm.
achieve the goals that we have for this user, right? So SNC-based single sign-on to the backend system, depending on the user's assignment to a department in the organization. For simplicity, we basically say if that user is part of the IT department, though all of the users in the IT department should have access to that SAP system because they need to develop ABAP, great ABAP reports, etc. So, but all of the users, at least those that belong to the company, to our fictitious company Best Run here, and that are true members and not guests in the Entra tenant, should always get the access to the Microsoft 365
Yeah.
applications. Yeah.
Hmm.
So basically, every employee, no matter which department they belong to, get all the license
Outlook.
required here.
Yeah. Hmm.
Only those with department information technology will get provisioned to the SAP system. This is taken care on the Entra side by so-called access packages. For those in the audience who are familiar with SAP Identity Management, think of access packages as an equivalent to the SAP IDM business roles. So business roles in IDM basically are organizational level roles that reference then the technical permissions in various systems across the landscape. Access packages are quite or follow quite the same approach. An access package can contain things like, for example, user groups, which we leverage here in this scenario. So we have two access packages here, one that refers to a user group called M365 user, and the SAP A4H, which is the SID of that backend system that refers to the SAP user group. So that Microsoft 365 user group is also assigned to the license in the Microsoft Admin Center. So whenever a user has access or is a member of this Microsoft 365 user group, he automatically or she automatically obtains a license for Microsoft 365. And if the user, depending on the department value, also gets auto-assigned by this access package to the SAP user group,
Hmm.
all of the users in this group will be picked up by an enterprise application in Entra that basically represents the Cloud Identity Services tenant in Entra. And this is the place where all of the provisioning magic happens from Entra to Cloud Identity Services. So for example, we here take care for creating or deriving attributes that are needed in this scenario for the user. So we have quite a lot already that exists in the underlying directory of that tenant. However, for example, the SNC mapping is one of these attributes that we need to create on the fly. And
Yeah.
this is the task of exactly that enterprise application here. That by the way, also comes from the Microsoft Entra application gallery that contains a huge amount of pre-configured templates or enterprise applications for SaaS solutions and cloud solutions, such as SAP Cloud Identity Services. So you don't start from scratch here. You basically go to the application gallery, create a new enterprise application based on the SAP Cloud Identity Services enterprise application you find in the gallery, and then you can further modify this, and I show you exactly where in a second. Yeah, and then finally, when the user arrives here, it's been picked up by the identity provisioning service from the identity directory and provisioned to the backend system, which is only possible through the cloud connector. That requires that the cloud connector is connected to a paired sub-account to this cloud identity services tenant. Quick reminder here, when you start maybe also following this tutorial and the blog post and take a look at this scenario, ensure that you follow SAP's required pairing of the regions for the sub-account and the tenant. Otherwise, identity provisioning service won't be able to connect to the connectivity service in that sub-account. So in my setup, I have also followed that SAP documentation so that I have a BTP sub-account in the US West region on Azure and a corresponding sub-account, Cloud Identity Services tenant also in the US West region. So it's not possible to implement such a scenario, for example, if this Cloud Identity Services tenant would be in Sydney or in any other region. So that's quite important. That's why I also highlighted it here on that slide. And basically that's it. So we will start, as I said, step 0 will be we will create the user, that we have enough time that the user can traverse and travel through that provisioning scenario, and then we will take a look at the configuration on the Entra side, how the Entra provisioning agent is connected, take a look at the setup of the access packages, which are quite important here for this scenario, and the auto assignment. We will take a look at the Cloud Identity Services enterprise application and the configuration there. We will then jump over to the SAP side, take a look at the setup for between the cloud connector and the sub account and the Cloud Identity Services tenant. Then we take a look at the cloud connector, the connectivity service, and the destination. And finally, I missed one step, so I need to work on my animation. So in between, we'll certainly also take a look at the provisioning, identity provisioning setup in SAP Cloud Identity Services to just to take a look at the source and target definitions. Okay.
Fantastic.
Enough said, enough slides. Let's go into the system. So let me start on the domain controller here to create our new user. I will, here we go. So I'm on the domain controller here, and let me start the...
So this is your Active Directory on-premise, basically, nothing in the cloud.
Nothing in the cloud. So full on-premise. As you can see, I've installed the Active Directory domain services here. So it's a Windows Server 2019 that has this role of the domain controller activated. It also has some other services like ADFS, etc., but those don't play any role. And I also need to mention there's also the cloud connector installed on that system, right? So we may also already, while we are waiting for the user management to open, maybe let's first create the user. So we now create a new user. And then probably first need to prove that this user doesn't exist.
No user in the SAP system.
So let's go to the SAP system for a second and verify that. And that system also runs in my test landscape here. So it's the Docker-based image, which I love to use for such scenarios. I can highly recommend this system. Or it's easy to set up and provides you with all the means. So, although there is let's go quickly to SU01 to see which users are in our system. There shouldn't be so many. Right. So you see there is, so we will use user Tina test now. She will get an SAP login with T test. Yeah, so
Mhm.
she doesn't appear here.
Yeah,
so
she's not
far.
there.
And
It's in the SAP system. Great.
no, she is not there. So let's create Tina test in our Active Directory. Okay. And she will get the logon name t-test, and that will be also the logon name in the SAP system later, right? Okay. For simplicity, she doesn't have to change it. And I mean, we are in a testing environment, so we can live with that. And then, okay, so now we have created user Tina test. I think we also probably at this point in time already take care for setting the organizational attributes. Yeah, so remember, we want that this user, so she will only get a user if she if she is assigned to the IT department. Yeah, so so that needs to be also maintained in the properties. Let's give my virtual machine a little time here to bring up the properties.
Because otherwise it would not be replicated to the SAP system. If Tina test has some other roles, then sure, she might get Outlook, access to Outlook, or access to PowerPoint or whatever, but not to the SAP system. And
then, but she won't get access unless she belongs to the department information technology. Okay, so let's see if my properties dialog opens in a second. Okay, so I'm running a little bit low on resources on my local system. I'm running this domain controller plus the SAP system plus actually even a domain joint workstation to this domain controller. So bear with me for a second until
no problem.
that dialog comes up. And okay, here we go. So if we go to the organizational settings here, so let's first enter the right. So it's information technology. Let me see if I typed it correctly. Information technology, yes. And company is Best Run Corp. And basically that's what we all need in order to assign her to all of the permissions in Entra, to both of these access packages, which we will take a look in a second. Okay, good. So let's apply those changes to Tina Test's account and leave it there. Let's jump over now. So now, again, it takes some time until the process runs through, but just for everyone to relocate where we are. So we have done step 0. Now let's take a look at the Entra, on the Entra side, at the access packages and the cloud configuration. Yeah. So let me go to my Entra portal, which is here. So the Entra Admin Center. Let's maybe start first with the setup of the synchronization between Active Directory and Entra ID. As I said, we have the Cloud Sync agent or the Cloud Provisioning agent installed on the domain controller. We see there's a status healthy, which basically says our sync direction from ADU to Entra ID is working obviously fine. We may also already see, if we go to the provisioning logs here, that we may already have the user synchron. Okay, not yet. So it takes, I think, every 5 minutes or so, the agent starts again synchronizing. So let's wait for that a second. And now let's jump to the access packages. So again, the access packages are really key here in order to automate the process of user assignment to groups and then finally to the permissions in the backend system. So when we go to identity governance, entitlement management, so access packages are part of entitlement management. That's the feature in Entra ID or in Entra, and here we see all of the access packages defined in that tenant. We have this one from part 1. So this is the access package we used in the blog post series part 1. But for this scenario, basically those two are the two relevant access packages that we need. So let's maybe first start with the M365. So again, access packages can be compared to business roles in SAP Identity Management. So they consist of one to many technical resources that if a user is assigned to an access package, the user will get membership, for example, or be added to a Teams channel in those resources here. Yeah. So here we have the M365 user group, yeah, which is assigned to the license on the admin center in M365. So that, right. And if we take a look at the policies for that, which define the auto assignment rules, we can basically see that all users matching the company name Best Run Corp in the company name property, right? And who are not guests, but members in the tenant, yeah, which is the case for all of Best Run's employees, yeah, they will get assigned to that access package. Let's take a look at the SAP access package for a second. Again, the resource role is quite similar. We have it assigned to the user group SAP user in the tenant, and the policies, not a big surprise, basically say that every user matching the department attribute equals information technology will get auto assigned to that access packages, and with that step assigned to all of the resources listed here, in this case just the SAP user group. All right. Now let's finally take a look at the application, at the enterprise application that represents the Cloud Identity Services tenant in our Entra tenant, and that is responsible for all of the provisioning, and along with the provisioning, the user mapping and attribute mappings. Yeah? So if we, let me just pick the right one, as you can see, okay, so this is the enterprise application, again, created out of the template from the application gallery. And if we go, so maybe first of all, important to understand is that an enterprise application, or actually all applications in a tenant, they need to be assigned to users and groups. And what I did here is I assigned this enterprise application representing the Cloud Identity Services tenant to the SAP user group, the same group that we saw earlier in the access package, right? So under provisioning, all of the setup is done for the user provisioning of the of users to Cloud Identity Services tenant. Yeah. So first of all, we maintain here the admin credentials that are needed in order to let this enterprise application provision users to Cloud. So those are Cloud Identity Services credentials that need to be created on the Cloud Identity Services side in order to authorize Entra to do its work. Maybe even more interesting are the mappings. So let's take it. So again, I haven't created all of them. 99% of them came out of the box from the application gallery. Yeah, so no work to be done. I've only added 2. Those 2 here at the end, and those are exactly those. Let me expand that row a little bit here, or that column. So I'm making use of custom attributes in the schema of Cloud Identity Services. It allows us to pass, I think, a total of maybe 10 or even more custom attributes. And I'm using those custom attributes to do exactly what we need to do for the SNC-based login of that user. So first of all, we derive from the user principal name, from the on-premises user principal name. Remember, when I created that user in AD, I gave the user the name t-test, right? So t-test at the corporate domain. This is exactly what's extracted here from that user, or from that on-premises user principal name, and put into upper cases as usual for an SAP login. Yeah. So this is the first attribute, and the second one constructs the SNC mapping that will be needed for the user in order to let the user single sign on to the system. Yeah, we'll take a look at that also as well in the backend, right? So with that, basically one of the, at least for me, key architectural design decisions are made, and that is that any sort of attribute mappings, logic that might be put here in the most simplest form by using those predefined functions like to upper or join. There's a huge amount of functions that can be used here to manipulate and transform attributes. Yeah, but I would, so in those IDM migration scenarios, I would highly recommend to implement this identity logic at one place. Yeah, you may also choose to do it in Cloud Identity Services. Yeah, there are also definitely capabilities there to allow you to do so. But I decided to do it here in Entra. And even if you have even further requirements that go beyond what you can do with those functions, you can also, for example, make use of logic apps, yeah, to do any sort of calculation, manipulation, whatever you need, look up into external data sources for whatever reasons. Yeah, so this is probably the most simplest form, but I would recommend again to do it at one place and not on several, because then you might get lost.
I agree, and I mean, it makes actually a lot of sense. I mean, here's the first place where the mapping basically happens, right? Where you do username to user principal name or company to company name, and then it's great to see that you can actually also add some modification of the data as well, like just this to uppercase or something like that.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's nice that you can actually already here do some modification, which is probably good enough for a lot of cases already.
Yeah, and by the way, there's also a great way to test those mappings. Like if you go to edit here, and then you can basically here test the function if you want to
nice.
use it. Yeah. So there's
if the two uppercase is really working and stuff.
Yeah. So it's a great way here to really manipulate those settings.
Okay.
So
cool.
Let me jump over now. Let me quickly go back to our slide. So we were here. We are now going over. Okay, maybe just to.
Should we quickly check whether the user now was actually already synchronized from Active Directory to Entra ID?
That's a good idea. Let's go back to our hybrid management. Cloud sync. Okay, let's see. Provisioning logs. Here we go. So Tina test has been updated like a minute ago or so, or 2 minutes ago, right?
Okay, perfect.
Exactly. So by the way, those are exactly the two operations that reflect what we did in AD.
Nice.
If you remember, we created the user and then we opened the properties dialog and then changed the. Yeah,
fantastic.
So that's exactly what's reflected here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. We may shouldn't wait until, because I think we are running a little bit out of time. So these auto assignments that I showed you with the access packages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those may take 10 to maybe even sometimes 30 minutes. Yeah. So that's why I would recommend now, if we go to speed up the things a little bit, so we don't wait for the auto assignment to happen with the access packages. Believe me, it works. I would probably say let's go to Tina tests, and she should appear right at the end of our user list, and assign her to the SAP user group manually at this point,
so
right?
This would be done automatically, but we are just forcing this now. We're doing this manually.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So let's go here and SAP and assign her quickly to the SAP user.
Mm-hmm.
So just, all right. Oh, I think I didn't click save. I need to, okay, wait a second.
Maybe you didn't select, here.
Now I need to, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see if I refresh that. Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, there it is.
So she is now added to the SAP user, which then now basically triggers the cloud, the enterprise application that we saw, because it detects, there is a new user that belongs to that SAP user group, which is in scope of my users, right? And then, and I can quickly also show you that here. So the settings says that here, the scope is sync only assigned users and groups, and those are exactly those who are in that group, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. Let's go to maybe quickly to the BTP side. Yeah. So the sub account, as I said, requires a connection to a cloud connector, which resides on our domain controller in this scenario, right? So we see the cloud connector from the domain controller is successfully connected here to the sub account. Yeah. And we have a destination configured, which allows the provisioning service in Cloud Identity Services to connect through the Cloud Connector to the SAP system. And let me also quickly show you that. So we have a destination configured for the SAP Backend system, right? It's of type RFC, proxy type on proxy, so not internet, because we want to pass the connection through the Cloud Connector. And it requires some SAP-specific properties for the backend, such as the SID and the instance number, etc., the client ID, etc., etc. Yeah, and it certainly also needs to have the authentic or the credentials of a user that already exists that I created before in the SAP system in order to, so similar like the Entra ID tenant needed the credentials to provision into the Cloud Identity Services. We also need here a user that has the required authorizations to call basically the underlying RFCs and BAPIs for user management in the backend system. Yeah, and this is the user, I called it SAP IPS. It's a user of type system, so not a dialog user, it's a system user, right? A technical user that has the proper authorizations in the backend system. Yeah, so I don't go into the details of the setup for this, for the role of that user. You can all read that in the blog post. Yeah, so it's really detailed documented there. Okay, now let's jump over. So again, we were basically here. Now we go over here to the Cloud Identity Services tenant and take a quick look at the provisioning setup. So here we are in the admin console of the Cloud Identity Services tenant. Well, actually, we may check if Tina already arrived here. Let's see. Let's see if we have Tina already showing up here. Okay, not yet. So maybe then we can trigger the provisioning. Actually, let me show you that also a way to speed up things. If you don't want to wait and you are really under pressure, you can also go into your enterprise application for your provisioning scenario. And then under provisioning, you can basically provision on demand. Let me go into quickly here. So there is this provisioning or provision on demand feature. So if we look for a user, so Tina in ours.
Okay, then you can.
So if I choose Tina here and say provision, I basically now trigger the provisioning for just this one user to Cloud Identity Services. And as we can see, I think everything was successful. Yeah. Okay, so action was performed, and now we should see in a second Tina also appearing here. But before we check back again, let me quickly show you the provisioning setup. So we have as a source system in identity provisioning of our Cloud Identity Services tenant set up the local directory. Yeah, not a big deal. We also made sure that the custom attributes that we get from, remember the SNC name, and the user alias are also proper or taken from the inbound SCIM message and mapped properly to the attributes of the local user in the that's taken care here. You can see there's this long schema name of the attributes, which are also copied over to the user in the local directory, so that we just pass them as is without any sort of transformation logic, which could be applied here, certainly.
Yeah.
But as I said before, we want to keep all of that in Entra.
Yeah. So you're doing here just a plain mapping.
Exactly.
Whereas on the Entra ID side,
yes,
you did some modification.
I do a little bit of the transformation magic. Exactly. Yeah. And on the target systems, not a big surprise. We see our SAP system here defined, right? It's of type SAP Application Server ABAP. And when you set up a system similar to the Entra gallery, you also get a huge list of predefined templates for SAP solutions on-prem as well as on the cloud. And one of them is the SAP Application Server ABAP, where you then certainly need to specify a destination that this system will be used, or the provisioning service will be used for this system to provision users. And if you remember, we gave the destination in our BTP sub-account the name SAP A4H. Yeah? And that's, so going back here, you see that's the name as it appears here. And again, you are only able to select the destination and find it if you stick to the region pairing between the Cloud Identity Services tenant and the BTP sub-account that I mentioned before, this US West thing, for example. Yeah, so quite important to consider. All right. And I think that's it. Let me see the Cloud Connector. Yeah, we can quickly take a look at the Cloud Connector, which is running here as well on my
locally.
locally on my machine. Yeah, here we go. So administrator. Oh, okay, too long.
Maybe a refresh. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Okay. So basically here we have defined or connected to the sub account, and for that sub account we have defined the mapping to our SAP backend system. And this list is basically the list of function modules that this system is allowed to call. And just to keep things short, there's basically a corresponding role with that makes use of the sRFC authorization object that then defines in the authorization fields exactly this list of function modules that this SAP IPS user is allowed to call. So that's the magic here from the from the connectivity side. All right, let's see if user Tina test has arrived in our tenant. Let's see, user management. She's not there. Maybe I should wait a second. T test. Let me see if I find her. Aha, okay, here we go. So the search could be a little bit improved. So we see that Tina test has been successfully going back to my slide. She has been now successfully provisioned from Entra provisioning to Cloud Identity Services. Now let's also see if the identity provisioning already took up the user and provisioned it to the backend. If we go to the provisioning logs, which is a great place to look for the current status. Okay, we see that might. So we have a 30-minute interval where there is an automatic repeat running in that system. But again, we can also trigger a manual synchronization. So otherwise, we would have now to wait for 30 minutes until 18, 2:18. This is what we do not want to do. Therefore, let me go to my source system. And there are, and under the jobs, under the read jobs, I can, so this is where I defined that schedule of 30 minutes. 30 is the minimum time. You can't go lower than that. But if I click run now, I basically trigger provisioning on demand, similar to what I did in the Entra tenant, right? And right.
But I mean, now we're in the SAP world anyways. We crossed the Microsoft to SAP boundary, basically.
This is what we already crossed. Exactly.
And now it's just Cloud Identity Service replicating the users back to an on-premise SAP system.
So this is purely SAP business, so to say. Let's see once. So we should see in a second, maybe under real-time logs, we may even see the job already appearing. Okay, maybe go back here. Okay, again, it takes a little bit of time until that job arrives here in the logs. But shouldn't take too long.
Okay, but as you said, so now we have the user in Cloud Identity Service. Now it would be replicated down to our SAP system on premise, and then the user should also show up there in SU01 with all the properties. So also with the SNC related properties, because the mapping was done from Entra ID when it was then mapped over to Cloud Identity Service, which means then that this user is ready to do a single sign-on via SNC to the SAP via the SAP GUI, for example.
Exactly. That's our IOC. Here we have the job now running. Okay, took a little bit more time than usual, but yes, exactly. So a usual question that comes up is, okay, how do we also automate authorization management in the backend system of that user, right? So between SAP and the Microsoft, between SAP and the Cloud Identity Services and the backend system, you typically do so by creating a group that is equally named to the role in the backend system. So, for example, if there is, like in this picture, even here, let me bring up my slide. And let me zoom in a little bit here because it's quite small font here. So you may see that there's a profile, a role in the backend system. It's a pre-delivered role from SAP called SAP_BC ABAP Developer 5. It's for ABAP 5 development. Yeah. So if you want to assign a user to that role in the backend system, you need to create an equally named role, a user group in the Cloud Identity Services tenant. Yeah, so I have it here already existing and assign the user to that group. Now, certainly the question is, how do I do so if I have the user maybe also already assigned to a group that may also be equally named on the Entra side? So basically, without having to do this manual step here. The SCIM interface today between Microsoft Entra and Cloud Identity Services does not provision user groups and memberships of users in these groups today. But this is part of our collaboration to improve the integration between Microsoft and SAP, is to exactly address that need to also provision the groups and group memberships via this path here, so that in the end, what you could do, for example, you could assign to that access package the group SAP BC ABAP Developer 5, which will then automatically lead to an assignment of that user in the backend system to the appropriate roles in the backend system. Yeah. So, so let's see if that job completed. It completed successfully, and and if we go to the details, we can also see that the statistics basically tell us that an entity of type user, our TINA test, has been for system SAP FOH, there was a write operation that created a new user there. It doesn't say which user, but I think we all know which user is meant here. So let's go back to our backend SAP system. Exactly. I may have. Okay, let's go again as a developer here. So who has all the power that is needed? Let's do that. All right. SU01. So let's see if we have user TINA test in the list. Et voila, T-test.
Nice.
So,
and can you take a closer look, and can we check the SNC parameters?
Absolutely. Let's go here and go here. And here we see the SNC mapping has been nicely created following the format that is needed here for the SNC mapping, which will then allow, and I think due to the looking at the clock, we could now also log in on the workstation and verify that sync sign-on works. But so I think that's obvious that with the right mapping and with the integration of SNC and the setup of SNC, certainly that needs to be taken in the backend system to allow to enable such a scenario. But from an user provisioning and setup perspective, everything works fine.
Great.
Yeah. All right.
Fantastic. That was a beautiful run through. TINA test, creating TINA test, and then having her in the SAP system. That's really great. Yeah.
All right. Good. Yeah. And
fantastic.
Also the Microsoft side has also taken the license assignment. So once the auto assignment runs for the access packages, TINA will also have access to the Microsoft apps. Yeah. So I think with these tutorials and guidance, and again, I would highly recommend take a look at the
we'll link the blog post.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah. So those really provide exactly on that level that we applied here in the podcast. And even with further details needed, guide you through the full setup and flow for this scenario. Certainly, there are also other and also even more important sources to look at. I also added them here in the slides. Maybe we can also put them
absolutely
on the podcast.
We'll definitely do that.
All right, good,
great. Martin, thank you so much for this end-to-end walkthrough. I think this was really great, and it really showed how well this is architectured. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again.
Was a pleasure. Thanks, Holger.
Great, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.